This is PediaCast. CME.
Welcome to PediaCast, CME, a pediatric podcast for providers. And now, direct from the campus of Nationwide Children's, here is your host, Dr. Mike.
Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to PediaCast CME. It is a continuing medical education podcast for healthcare providers. This is Dr. Mike coming to you from the campus of Nationwide Children's Hospital. We're in Columbus, Ohio. It's episode 73 for March 24th, 2022. We're calling this one Introduction to EQ, Emotional Intelligence in Clinical and Academic Medicine. I want to welcome all of you to the program. So we have a very special episode of PediaCast CME for you this week as we explore emotional intelligence and its impact on clinical and academic medicine. Now, if you're like me, and I know many of you are not like me, but if you are, emotional intelligence is a new tool in our box, an important tool, and one that was not shared with me in medical school, residency training, or in any faculty development program. And yet, once you have this tool, once you learn how to use it, emotional intelligence is a game changer. Now, the abbreviation for emotional intelligence is EQ, which makes it tempting to compare with IQ. However, EQ and IQ are very different things. IQ is useful in learning the practice of medicine, sure, there's no question about that. But EQ is important for achieving success in medicine because, as it turns out, IQ is not a very good predictor of success. A better predictor of success is EQ, and that is an observation that is based in evidence. Now, why is that? Well, it's because EQ is all about relationships. And relationships ultimately drive outcomes. And there are all sorts of relationships in clinical and academic medicine. We have doctor-patient relationships, student-teacher relationships, mentee-mentor, and colleague-colleague relationships. And very often, the secret of success lies within these relationships. So how do we nurture our connection with others? Well, we do it by becoming more aware of our emotions and the emotions of those around us, because those emotions drive decisions. They drive the words we use, they drive the actions we take, all of which have a huge impact on outcomes. The other cool thing about EQ is that you can increase your emotional intelligence. That is not the case with IQ. You know, we're all born with a certain IQ, and that is that. IQs cannot be grown. EQ, on the other hand, it can be grown. We can improve our EQ fairly easily, and that has made a big difference for those who have traveled this path before you. So our goal today is to introduce emotional intelligence as a concept. We'll share the 4 foundational key skills of EQ and provide you with some strategies for strengthening those skills within the context of clinical and academic medicine. To help us explore the topic, we have a really super fantastic guest with us this week, Erica Banta. She is a certified leadership development and succession strategist and the Director of Talent Management for The Ohio State University. She will join us in the actual physical studio, which is another reason for my excitement today. After 2 years of remote interviews, thanks to COVID-19, it is good to be back in the studio. So she's going to join us. Before I introduce her to all of you, let's cover our usual quick reminders. Don't forget you can find us wherever podcasts are found. And if you like what you hear, please remember to subscribe to our show so you don't miss an episode. Also, please consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts so that others who come along looking for free continuing medical education credit will know what to expect. Speaking of that credit, it's really easy to claim. Simply listen to the podcast, which you are about to do, and then head over to the show notes for this episode. You'll find those at pediacastcme.org. And there'll be a link to a post-test in the show notes. Follow that link to Cloud CME. Take and pass the post-test, and the Category 1 credit is yours. And we do offer credit to many pediatric professionals, not just doctors, also nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, social workers, and dentists. And we're able to do that because Nationwide Children's is jointly accredited by many professional organizations. So it's likely we offer the exact credits you need to fulfill your state's continuing medical education requirements. Of course, you want to be sure the content of the episode matches your scope of practice, which in the case of emotional intelligence is going to be everybody. Complete details are available at PediaCastCME.org. We're also on social media. We love connecting with you there. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Simply search for PediaCast. And we have a handy contact link if you would like to suggest a future topic for the program. You'll find that at PediaCastCME.org. Also, want to remind you the information presented in every episode of our podcast is for general educational purposes only. We do not diagnose medical conditions or formulate treatment plans for specific individuals. Also, your use of this audio program is subject to the PediaCast CME Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find at PediaCastCME.org. So let's take a quick break. We'll get Erica Banta settled into the studio, and then we will be back to talk about emotional intelligence. It's coming up right after this. Erica Banta is the Director of Talent Management at The Ohio State University. She holds an MBA from Franklin University and is a certified leadership development and succession strategist, which means she's an expert in helping leaders achieve their full potential as they drive the success of an organization. As it turns out, solid leadership skills are also important in clinical and academic medicine, and one of these skills, emotional intelligence, is particularly important for medical providers. That's what she's here to talk about, emotional intelligence, also known as EQ. So let's give a warm PediaCast welcome to our guest, Erica Banta. Thank you so much for stopping by today.
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Mike. It's good to be here, and welcome back to your studio.
Oh, it is so good to be actually in the studio with a guest live instead of the Zoom things, because I think we're all just so tired of Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
I mean, they're convenient, but so anyway, let's turn our attention to emotional intelligence. What does that term mean? Let's just start with a quick definition. When we think about emotional intelligence, what are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great start. But I want to take even a step back from that and talk about what is an emotion. If we're going to build this foundation of language, let's start there. And, we know that emotions are they're just really physiological experiences in our body. They manifest themselves in many different ways. So think about an extreme emotion that you might have. What are your body responses?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question because, when you're anxious, you can feel your heartbeat, feel it beating faster. You might feel it even skipping a couple beats. Your mouth becomes dry. You really become aware of, bodily functions that you might not normally be aware of.
That's right. Some of the favorites when I talk about this are when you're experiencing nervousness, the way that it can change the cadence of your voice. Some people get what I would call the creeping red neck. And those are things that are very difficult for us to control. So when we think about emotions, they're really just those neuromuscular, respiratory, cardiovascular, hormonal changes. And they can even modify thoughts and behaviors, which is really interesting.
Yeah. So as we go along here, there is a book that we're going to reference a couple of times, and I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes for folks, called Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Dr. Travis Bradbury and Dr. Gene Greaves. And in that book, they really describe how a lot of our thought processing actually goes through the emotional part of the brain before it goes to the executive thinking parts of the brain. So tell us why that's an important thing to keep in mind.
That's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. We learn EQ differently than most other learned things. So we can't really read a book and say that we're raising our EQ. It is a practice, and it goes through those emotional parts of our brain first so that we can then understand how our behaviors change. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more later about some of that self-management and self-awareness. But it's really, I think the big differentiator between the two is how we learn, how we grow our EQ, which can be. Neuroplasticity is a pretty hot topic right now. And EQ and growing that really falls into that category with practice and repetition. And I have to do that with people. I can't do that alone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've defined what emotions are, that they're these physiologic responses, and that they're really involved in our decision making on a day-to-day basis because our thinking goes through those emotional centers. So then what is emotional intelligence? How do we get smart about our emotions?
So emotional intelligence then, if we think about emotions, is just really your ability to recognize and understand your emotions, and then your skill at using this awareness to manage yourself and your relationship with others. And that's a key focus. It's not just about self. We'll talk about those relationships with others. Yeah.
And then when I say EQ, as I describe emotional intelligence, that kind of invokes thoughts about IQ. And I'm sure that's why they came up with EQ. It's because there's no Q word in emotional intelligence. But they're liking it to IQ. So how is EQ different from IQ?
Yeah. It's important to understand what emotional intelligence is not. So EQ is a set of skills that can be molded and improved and changed. And in that way, it's different than IQ and also different than personality style. I like to talk about the intersect of those three things as really being the key to success. So EQ, IQ, and personality style, which are three very separate things. So IQ is not really what you know, but your innate ability to learn. So on the other hand, we think of personality, and that's just really a set of behavioral tendencies. They're relatively stable by the time we're in our, I'd say, mid-20s. But on average, EQ in that performance puzzle can change. So EQ, we can raise our awareness of that, using it with others. And really on average, EQ predicts 60% of the variance in job performance across all jobs and industries. So when we talk about the medical profession versus academics versus manufacturing versus business, it's a human component. It's not embedded in one industry or another.
Yeah, and it's so important to understand because it's one of those things that hasn't until recently been talked about too much. In fact, most people, when they heard I was doing an interview today on emotional intelligence, they're like, I don't know what that is. It's not something that I've heard of before. And yet, for something to be such a strong predictor of success, it would make sense that it is something that we should know a lot about. And which is, our goal today is to educate the listeners on exactly what EQ is. Another data point that I had come across in preparing for this is that there have been studies that show that people with the highest levels of IQ outperform those with average IQ only 20% of the time. Mm-hmm. So in terms of performance, EQ is really can help folks who may have a lower IQ, can help them to perform and have success that you're not going to get just by having a high IQ, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, so I like to put it in this way. Think about two physicians. And they are of equal age, equal background, equal education, equal time and tenure and experience, all things remaining equal. Which one then becomes more successful? And it's that sort of that unknown of how they make people feel, whether it's their colleagues, their patients, their relationships with family members. That is going to predict their success, all other things being equal. And it's that way in business as well. If I have two HR professionals who everything remaining equal and they both have equal access to data, then the one who is more successful is the one who can take that data and make it relatable to me and how they make me feel about the information. And that's all coming from EQ.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. In the introduction to the show, I mentioned that EQ is really important because it drives relationships. And so I had mentioned that in medicine, we have a lot of relationships. We have patient-doctor relationship. We have student-teacher relationships. When we're mentoring others, the mentee-mentor relationship. We work on research projects together. So there's colleague relationships there. And it really is, when you think about success, how we engage with other people. I mean, right in the exam room, I'm going to have a bigger impact on families when I connect with them and I explain, why certain things are important. Why is it that I'm recommending so many hours of sleep for your kid? I'm not just telling you I care about you and want to know, your child not getting enough sleep. How is that impacting their life? And that relationship building can really impact other people in terms of making decisions and doing the things that we want them to do. And so even in academic medicine, where we have relationships with our colleagues, I mean, we know that networking is so important, being able to work together and collaborate with other people. And all of that is driven through EQ, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Well, and the ability to form relationships, and I would even say influence without authority, are key competencies in the context of many organizations, especially when we see movement towards flatter organizational structures. Plus, recent research on emotional intelligence has found a really tight link to just the on-the-job performance. So individual performance and relationship management, they're so intertwined when we think about raising our EQ.
Yeah. There are 4 foundational skills of EQ that we really need to know about and kind of dive into in order to strengthen our emotional intelligence. So let's just introduce exactly what those 4 foundational skills are.
Oh, absolutely. So the first 2 skills, when I think about the 4 core sort of EQ quadrants, are around personal competence. So what I see in myself is self-awareness. This is the ability to recognize your own emotions and how they affect your thoughts and behavior, know your strengths and weaknesses, and really have self-confidence. What I do is the self-management piece. So that's that second core, and that's the ability to control those impulsive feelings, behaviors, manage your emotions in healthy ways, take initiative, follow through on commitments, and really adapt to changing circumstances. So then if we look past that, then the second 2 skills create one's social competence. So social awareness is just the ability to understand the emotions and needs and concerns of others, so of other people, and pick up on emotional cues, feel comfortable socially, and really recognize the power dynamics in a group or organization. So then if we move on past that, then the final piece is that relationship management that you were talking about. And that's just the ability to develop and maintain good relationships, communicate clearly, inspire and influence others, work well in a team. Conflict management falls into that category. So those are the big 4 when we think about the basic core of EQ.
Yeah. I want to repeat those because they're so important. And they make sense. So one is, you said self-awareness. Mm-hmm. So we want to be aware of our emotions, why we're feeling the way that we may be feeling, which there may be reasons that we don't initially think of. They may be deeper down reasons that we have to dig into a little bit. But just to recognize when emotion is there and to be aware of it. And then we're going to manage ourselves based, remember those thoughts go through that emotional center. And so we're going to want to manage those emotions and behave in appropriate ways. And a lot of times those do fuel what we say, the tone of our words, the actions that we take. And so that's all that self-management part of it as we think about our emotions. And then moving on to others, social awareness, how are they feeling? What's driving their behaviors? Because they may just, not be managing themselves very well. And so then we can have an emotion in response to that. And then that may make us not manage ourselves very well. And so things can spiral out of control. But when we understand the emotions that people are thinking then we may have more empathy for why they're behaving the way that they do. And then that ultimately culminates in relationship management as we think about our emotions, their emotions, how we're engaging with one another. And this is something that really takes place in every exam room across the country on a daily basis, where, we're having engagements with patients who are upset about things. There's all, and we'll get into more, concrete examples of when this all, comes into play and becomes important. Moving on, I want to now focus on each of these each of these key elements of emotional intelligence. The first one is self-awareness. So what are some ways that we can improve our self-awareness?
The ones I like to talk about the most, which I think can really relate to everyone, is realizing when you're stressed. We spend so much of our lives in an imbalanced state, we don't know what it feels like to be sort of on the level. So I like to use a number system, and I think that maybe in the medical field, it's what's your pain level, right? So when I think about emotions and thinking about how stressed I am, and we'll talk about that word stress in a second. It means something different in my world. I'd say, 1 is everything is wonderful and choirs are singing, up to 10, where it's quite possibly the worst day.
Yeah.
And so realizing when you get from a 5 to a 6 to a 7, what does that feel like? What does that feel like in your body? How does it manifest itself? And what is your stress response to that when those numbers get higher? Can people around you see that you are getting to a 7 or an 8 or a 9? And so for that self-awareness piece, knowing when you feel that, maybe your shoulders are tense. Maybe you stop talking to people. I'm an angry typer so my colleagues in the office can tell when my levels start rising because I type really hard and fast. So recognizing those responses, I think, is a great way to really take a purposeful pause and realize that you are off center. And then discover the stress busting techniques that work best for you. What brings you back down, even a couple numbers from feeling that way. And maybe they're not able to be done in the moment. Maybe it's something that you need to go home when you're done with your shift and think about that. Some people count to 10. Some people practice mindfulness. Even I've coached folks to just look up and notice the ceiling above you. We don't look up or down very often. And it I'm dating myself now, but it lifts the needle off the record just for a moment, enough for our brain to shake some of that off.
Yeah. Very important points. And I wonder if listeners think about things as you practice medicine, whether that's in the exam room or academic medicine, and maybe you're working with a collaborative group that does cause your stress levels to start to go up. And I think we can all think of examples of when that happens. As I was preparing for this show, I tried to think of some scenarios where this is an issue. And one that really came to my mind, especially as we've traveled through COVID, and even before then, is engagement with vaccine hesitant parents. And this is a time and place when really emotions can rise because as a physician, we really care about the kids that we take care of. We really feel strongly, most of us do, the vast majority of us do, that the benefits of vaccines outweigh any risks that are there. And trying to get parents to understand that when they may be getting their information from another source. I mean, for me, that's one of the things that causes my stress level to start to rise. Like, don't you see that this is an important thing? But, you do. You start to feel your heart, beating a little faster. Your speech may change. You start to be a little bit more pressured in your speech. And I think part of that self-awareness of those things is also maybe being aware of how your response then sends a ripple out to other people and how then they may respond back to you based on how you are responding. And so I talk a little bit about the importance of, recognizing how we're feeling and how that affects others.
Well, I see that a lot when I'm working with faculty members who perhaps are in a teaching unit, and those students are watching the faculty to mirror their behavior, their response to colleagues, the relationship between perhaps faculty and staff. And so that's a really important piece, is that someone is always listening. Someone is always watching, and you are, in essence, teaching others around you that behavior is okay in that moment, in that situation. So it really takes some work to stop yourself and exhibit, in the situation you were talking about, empathy. Think about that parent and how perhaps they were raised, and really try to manage that relationship, but also your own emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was preparing for this too, one strategy that I had come across in terms of increasing our self-awareness is to lean into the discomfort. What does that mean? What does it mean to lean into the discomfort that we're feeling? Like, it would seem like we want to get away from it.
Oh, we absolutely love to get away from bad feelings, and we want to try to fix them very quickly. Noticing how those emotions are making us feel in our body. It's a basic tenet of mindfulness and attentional fitness, is just noticing when I am extremely angry or experiencing sadness or frustration. How does it feel? How does it feel in my body? And can I just sit in that feeling for a moment? Rather than trying to fix it. Our body wants to notice those things. And we also experience joy and great feelings because we allow ourselves to feel the yucky stuff too.
Yeah. Now you mentioned sort of joyful, happy feelings versus icky feelings. But even the icky feelings have a purpose, right? So, if we kind of switch our thinking a little bit, and instead of labeling them as bad feelings, trying to understand why they're there and what we can do about them, kind of makes them actually a good feeling. Because in the sense that even though it makes us feel icky, it's good to recognize why we are feeling icky. You can really get a lot of insight out of that.
You absolutely can. And it breaks patterns when we do that. When we're intentional about thinking about why I'm feeling a certain way, and I'll say unpacking those feelings, it can prevent them from coming back or being as strong if that situation arises again. Yeah,
absolutely. And so we, change our thinking from there's good feelings and bad feelings to there are feelings. And if we lean into them, then we can understand them better and understand how our responses are affecting other people around us. So as I think about self-awareness and our vaccine hesitant parent, I wanted to actually take this as an exercise with these strategies to increase our emotional intelligence. Like, what does that look like when the rubber meets the road? What does it mean to be more self-aware as I'm in an exam room with a vaccine hesitant parent? And so for me, I thought, again, I feel kind of bad. I want the child to get their vaccines. I think it's very important. And so I may start to have some frustration and anger, which are easy to label as bad feelings, but they do serve a purpose because we feel that way because we have that kid's best interest in mind. Like, we really want the child not to get pertussis, not to get meningitis from pneumococcus and from Haemophilus influenza type B.
Oh.
Yeah. So these are, parts of the vaccine that parents don't understand, that like these even, as many as 30, 40 years ago caused lots of kids to die, and we can prevent them. And so you can see how you become, and as I'm doing right now, becoming more impassioned, and I'm talking a little faster, I'm talking a little more forced, and the parent's going to notice that, right?
That's right.
And so really, this is then an instance where I want to recognize the emotion that I'm feeling so that then I can better manage that and we can have a better interaction and maybe a more successful discussion with the parent. Mm-hmm. Other scenarios, and as folks are listening to this, think about the things in your office or in your practice or in your research career that causes emotions. So other things I had come up with, there are families who are habitually late that you can, start to change the way that you're interacting with them because of that. There may be practice parameters that are in contrast to your individual values. So, you may feel like birth control is something that you don't believe in, but the family wants it and they're pushing for it, but you don't feel comfortable prescribing it. So there are instances where your personal feelings may get in the way of the best interest of the patient. We can have disagreements among colleagues, especially with practice differences. I mean, we may have one colleague who always prescribes a particular medication in a particular scenario, and then when they come to see you practice a little bit differently, and then they come to expect you to practice like your colleague does. So again, these are all examples of when we can start to feel those emotions start to build. And then in academic medicine, we can have unprofessional behavior with medical learners, with staff, with colleagues. Maybe we're beginning to recognize unprofessional behavior in ourselves, or we see it, or someone tells us, hey, you're being unprofessional. And then we have to stop and think about that. Too much on your plate. Some people have difficulty saying no, and then that can cause internal stress. When we see disparities based on sex, race, and orientation as we're going through our medical career, in terms of promotion and being invited to speak and those kind of things. Difficulty managing work-life balance, burnout. I mean, there's just so many areas, even though we're kind of going through this and talking about vaccine hesitant parents, you can really use this exercise and think about these 4 key components of emotional intelligence in lots of situations, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, I'd like to point out, as I listen to you go through these scenarios, there are 2 opportunities to increase your EQ in those scenarios. And the first opportunity is in the moment, and those things can happen in a split second. We can feel those feelings right away without time to analyze, well, where did this feeling come from? What is it a product of my history? We don't have time to do that in the moment. But just taking a moment to recognize it, understand what you're feeling in that moment, and then move through the scenario. But the other opportunity that we have is after, is then being intentional and thinking about, how did you feel in that moment? What triggered it? Where was the moment in that interaction where you started going from a 5 to a 6 to maybe a 7? And then naming it. So I talked before about stress and stress busting techniques. Stress is not a word that I allow to be used in my home too often because we can't analyze stress. It's a blanket term when it comes to emotions that could mean lots of things. So learning the words for emotions, not just good and bad, happy, sad, angry. We know the big ones, the heavy hitters. But being more intentional about saying, maybe in that scenario, I wasn't mad, I was frustrated. And then you can say, well, why were you frustrated? And then now it becomes a learning moment, and you're growing in your EQ practice because you're thinking about it and you're giving it a name. One of the exercises I love to do with groups around EQ is go around the room and have people say as many synonyms as they can for the word happy. And we get a lot, and somebody, puts a tick mark on the whiteboard. And then we go back around and we do the same exercise for synonyms for the word sad. And unfortunately, without question, every group knows more words for sad than they do for happy. So let's turn that around a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But it gets people's minds into thinking, wow, there are such a range of feelings, not just happy or sad.
Yeah. I imagine that's difficult to do that later, digging through your feelings of the day, because we get busy and distracted and may forget that actually happened. So I would suggest that you have some sort of system that will remind you later that there was an interaction that you need to think about a little bit more. I don't know, for each individual person how you do that. It may be just a sticky note that you stuff into a pocket, and then when you go home for the day and you're like emptying your pockets, like, wait, what is this crumpled up piece of paper? Oh, I need to think about this interaction that I had with a family or with a colleague that maybe didn't go exactly how I would have liked it to go. And then start thinking about those things a little bit more deeply. Why did you feel the way that you felt? Because that takes a little time to process. But if we want our future engagements to go better, that's processing that we have to do.
That's right. That's right. And that translates so wonderfully from the office to the house, to home, and our relationships with our families and our friends. It can be seamless. And when you work on EQ in the workplace, you're subconsciously also working on EQ at home.
Yeah, which will improve all of our relationships.
That's right.
So let's move on to self-management. So now we are aware that we are feeling stressed, but we're going to find a better word for it and really define what it is that's making us feel different than our baseline feeling. And then how do we go about better managing those feelings?
We've talked a little bit about those, the taking a pause, reflecting, but the management piece comes from what do we do then with those emotions, right? So when you feel, I want to ask you, Dr. Mike, when you feel angry or perhaps frustrated, what would you say that some people around you would notice in you?
I definitely start talking faster. I think my voice gets a little bit louder, like if maybe I can, you don't think this in the moment, but you're almost trying to bully someone into thinking or believing as you think because, you've put thought into it and know the risks and the benefits. And so it's easy to, maybe present yourself in a way that's coming across to the patient or your colleague, not so positively.
Yeah. Well, and do you experience feelings that flow from one to the other? So that's a piece of the awareness and management that come together. If you can notice that and notice those sensations in your body, just that moment to moment management of those. And, a strategy to build that is really to ask the people in your circle. Ask your family and friends and colleagues, what do you notice in me when I'm really happy and having a great day? What do you notice in me when I'm experiencing something that's frustrating? And take that feedback. It's such a gift. And see if you can flip that script a little bit.
Yeah. You said take a pause, like you start to feel those feelings. And so that's going to go into words and actions and how I'm coming across to people. But if you take that pause, then you can reset yourself. That's a little difficult to do, like in an exam room at first thought. But really you can because, especially in pediatrics, a kid has a fun shirt on. Your pause may be, oh, I'm going to call out that you have horses on your shirt, or those are really cute pajamas that you have on, or there's a sports team that you like or don't like. And, you can sort of take a pause in you're still engaging the family, because it would be weird, like to take a pause and count to 10 and you're just standing there not saying or doing anything.
Right.
In terms of if you're dealing with colleagues or learners, you may just have a drink that's sitting there, and just taking a pause to take a drink. That's a very natural thing to do. That may help you reset. So there are lots of opportunities to pause, even when it might not seem appropriate to truly pause, if that makes sense.
Oh, that absolutely makes sense. Yeah. And I would say that you have to plan. You have to be planful for self-management, especially if you're going into a situation that could invoke some strong feelings. So that's one piece of that, is just to plan it a little bit. I know if I am preparing for a difficult conversation, I know it's going to be difficult. I might practice. I might sort of walk through the scenario in my head first before I go into it. I think that helps also. Even in practice situations, we know that you would still experience some of the same emotions, hearing others say the words you might anticipate, and you can better manage your emotions at that point.
Yeah. Another strategy that we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to talk about, is making our goals public. So if there are ways in which we typically respond, and we recognize that that's not a healthy way to respond, and we want to change it, having others watch us that we trust, who will give us some feedback, can be helpful.
Oh, sure. Add a little more color to what you're talking about as far as your goals. Are you referring to your goals in raising your EQ, letting those around you know that is you are practicing that? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, that's certainly one possibility. Even to if there's a particular behavior that you want to change. Just as an example, I see a vaccine hesitant parent who once again says they don't want the vaccine. And so it would be easy for me to go back out to the nurse's station and I'm charting and to, maybe make some remarks about, like, I can't believe this parent doesn't want their kid to get their vaccines. But that just drives in that frustration and the way that I think about the family, and is really not a healthy way to change their minds in any way, shape, or form. But if other people in my office know I'm trying to be better about this, and they hear me complaining, like they can give me, I would want to welcome the feedback of, hey, but don't forget those parents they have that child's best interest in mind too. They've come across some information, or, the family members who tell them something, and just to be a sounding board to remind you that there's a lot of, variables at play here.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to what I was speaking about earlier, where we can't get better at this without other humans. And they can help us increase those types of things. So, I love having basically a partner or someone who is in my sphere, in my circle, that they can say, hey, Erica, is that really how you wanted to behave in that situation? Yeah. It's great to have folks like that in your circles.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think at the extreme end of what I would consider poor self-management is there are practices that make a policy of saying we will not see kids whose parents refuse vaccines, that they basically get kicked out of your practice, that we just will not see them. And, my issue with that is that you're a good, whoever it is that is saying that we want those people out, you're a good pediatrician. Like, you're making a huge difference in these kids' lives. And it's not like, they're still not going to get their vaccines when they go to a practitioner who is okay with them not having vaccines. So I think having a healthier way of dealing with your frustration than to just cast someone out. There's I think zero emotional intelligence in telling someone, I won't be your doctor if you don't do this.
I would agree with that. But also, if your goal is to have more vaccinated kids, then that's not the way to do it, right? It is building that relationship with the parent, influencing, using reason, and that's all coming from EQ.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to social awareness. So what is social awareness, and how can that help us raise our emotional intelligence? Well,
social awareness, being a good communicator and building relationships, it requires a lot more than just verbal skills. Sometimes what we say is less important than how we say it. So that social awareness is, are we thinking about how others are feeling when we're exhibiting our emotions? And can we pick up on if you're having a horrible day right now? I don't know you, but can I pick up on that? And that's really being intentional on paying attention to others. A big piece of that is just really observing. Observation is huge, and our nonverbals can tell each other a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, body language. Are their arms crossed? Are they sitting relaxed in the chair? Right there can tell you a little bit about what kind of day they have, or what maybe their expectations are for the interaction that you're about to have.
Oh, yeah. And we need to be able to accurately read and respond to the nonverbal cues that other people send us. That's really a huge skill in EQ is nonverbal communication. And it's a wordless form, but it's emotionally driven oftentimes. And nonverbals aren't just eye contact, facial expression, the tone of your voice, but it could be your posture and gesture, the use of touch, and even timing and pace. And I would argue that the concept of time is a huge nonverbal. You mentioned families that are habitually late. Many people take that as sort of a nonverbal that appointment isn't, I guess, that important to them, right? So Dr. Morabian many years ago came up with Morabian's rule that says only 7% of the communication that we give to others is around the words that we use. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I just want to point out that patient who's habitually late, if you dig into more, have the conversation with them, you may find out that they're relying on public transportation to get to your office, and they can't control bus schedules. And so you don't necessarily want to jump to conclusions. You really want to engage with people, find out, what their barriers are, where is it that they're having difficulty, and trying to help them.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about empathy and grace. And we usually give those things to others when we have more information. We can only get more information if we're having conversations. Yeah.
Now, regardless of how people are feeling, so they, may be having a bad day, is it true that if I greet them by name, that's going to kind of open the door to, better positive engagement?
Oh, 100% true. That is your identity. And someone greeting you by name is saying that your identity is important to me, that you're not a number. You are a human and important. Names go a long way in building relationships.
Yeah. Probably not as big of a deal in a primary care practice where you see the same patients over and over and you really get to know them. Those of us who work in emergency medicine and urgent cares, and also specialists who may just see a patient for one specific question and, never see them again. It's easy to just look at the chart, see what the chief complaint is, go in the room, and then be like, hey, kiddo, or hey, champ, or, and not really use their name. But using the child's name is just, really special to that kid. There's also a lot of names that I may have trouble pronouncing. And so I will do my best, but I will acknowledge, I'll be like, did I say it right? And then, if I did, great. If I didn't, then I do try to say it right. And then I'll always say like, oh, that's a really cool name. I love that. Or, where did that name come from? And, that can open up conversations too. But if you're going to have a difficult interaction, whether it be in an exam room with a family or with colleagues or staff members or learners in academic medicine, greeting people by their name really allows you to have more of an open discussion and feel like we can talk to each other.
Sure. And not only when you do that, you're not only building rapport, but you're starting to build trust. And I would say maybe the average patient or family, that makes you more of a person and a human, not just their doctor. And so now they have more of a trust in you and trust that what you're telling them is in their best interest.
Yeah. Another area where social awareness is going to be important is in terms of timing of whatever it is, that behavior that you might want to change. So as an example, I want to convince the vaccine hesitant parent that the science behind vaccines, and this is, really important. But if you know that they just had, a really bad day and when you walk in, their arms are crossed and there's something, that might not be the best time to try to change their mind about something.
It might not be, but I think a great way to get around that, if there's a timeliness factor, is to ask permission. I'm not sure how you're feeling right now, but I'd really like to talk about this thing with you. Can we do that now? That can open up a difficult conversation in such a gentle way that allows then you will be heard at that point, right? Rather than they're still thinking about those bad things that are happening. So definitely when you're having tough conversations, asking permission to do it first can really open that door.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And the more, and again, I'm thinking about the vaccine hesitant parent a lot here because I want to kind of march through what we're talking about and how that would affect, that particular interaction. But the more of these conversations that you have with a particular family over time, you probably are not going to be able to convince them to change their mind on, visit number one. But if you are, you use their name, you're really paying attention to social cues, you're thinking about your own response and why you feel the way that you do, then you're more likely over time to understand, to have that conversation where you can understand why they're making the decision, where are they getting their information, how can you perhaps guide them toward resources that are trustworthy. But those are conversations that may need to be serial conversations and not happen all at once.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're building not only the relationship with the parent and the family, but now you're building information. And I think a big information dump all at once isn't necessarily effective at getting people to change their behavior or change their mind.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And if they do give you specific resources, go look. Go look and see what it looks like. So then when other people mention it, you can speak knowledgeably and you can say, well, this is not exactly 100% right, or this data has been distorted or misrepresented. But unless you go and look at it yourself, you aren't going to really be able to speak intelligently about what they're basing their decisions on. Not that you necessarily want to make it into an argument, but just to try to explain, why you don't think that's the best resource.
Well, I love this scenario because as we talk through these 4 core quadrants of EQ, they're all building on each other, right? So when you're having that conversation, you're thinking about your self-awareness and your management and why are you feeling the way that you're feeling. And that manifests itself then in a positive conversation. And that's really the key, I think, in those scenarios is the point of conversation, not a one-way, let me feed you information because I am the doctor, but having that two-way conversation.
Yeah. And so we've gotten to relationship management, which is our 4th and final foundational key piece of emotional intelligence. And you're right, it really does build to here because I recognize how I'm feeling. I'm trying to manage how I respond to those feelings. I have some understanding of how the parent or the patient or my colleague or my learner is feeling. And then I can start to, but using all of that data, start to really manage that relationship in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And, conflict and disagreements are inevitable in almost every type of relationship, whether it's a professional relationship, a patient-doctor relationship, a family relationship. 2 people can't possibly have the exact same needs and opinions and expectations all the time. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. So when I think about the culmination of everything we're talking about, you can almost look at relationship management as sort of an intersect in conflict resolution. And resolving those conflicts in healthy and constructive ways can really strengthen trust between people. When it's not perceived as threatening or punishing, it can foster freedom and safety in relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some strategies then for strengthening our approach to relationship management?
I think one of the biggest ones for me is staying focused in the present. The books have closed on things that have happened in the past. And while we might have learned from those things, that isn't what's happening right now. So really staying focused in the present and looking at the situation right now can really help. That's a great strategy. Another one is choose your arguments, right? Choose what you think you should argue about. We do love to be right. We really do. But do we have to be, right? And so that's one of those pieces where if I choose, a lot of times, right, parents, think about a parent and a small child. You could argue over everything, but what's important to be right about? So I think that's another great strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Being present in the moment also means that you want to understand why a person may be feeling the way that they do, and it's okay to ask.
Oh, that's how we learn. That's how we learn about others. It's really hard to... everything that we're talking about, it just can't be done in a vacuum. We have to be bold and brave enough to ask those questions. And one of the other pieces to that too is, are you fostering a physical space where it feels safe to ask? Have you fostered what I would call psychological safety with your patients or customers or whatever industry we're talking about, where it's not only okay to ask questions from you, but ask questions to you.
Yeah. In emergency medicine, and particularly in the wintertime when there's flu season, there can be really long waits to before you get back to an exam room. I mean, sometimes several hours that people can wait before they come back. And I always try to, when I walk in the room, the first thing I say is thank you for waiting so long and for your patience. So we're trying to get everybody as fast as we can, but there's a limit on how we can do that. But now that I'm here, I am all yours. And so even though you waited this long, I want you to know that I care about your kid and your family. And so what can I do for you? And even just sitting down instead of standing, it shows that you care, that you're taking the time for this family, which may end up making the wait longer for other people, but you're going to have a better engagement, and just doing that right up front. And I think that's a part of, reading that social, you have social awareness because, the parent is standing there. They've got a mean look on their face and their arms are crossed because they just waited 3 hours to see you.
Right.
But, greeting them by name, explaining, why you had to wait so long, letting them know that you care and that you're here, that can really just change their attitude, with the snap of the fingers.
It really can. And I have a child, so I think about some of those scenarios and that I've been in. And I can feel my shoulders sort of calm down and drop when the physician sits down, right? When someone says hello, Erica, right? And introduces themselves. It makes it more human.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about relationship management, one of the other things that can happen is that we give mixed signals. And that seems like something that we would want to avoid.
We definitely want to avoid that. Asking follow-up questions, maybe not, do you understand? But can I help explain something further? Right. And that can help alleviate mixed signals. When you just ask, hey, did that make sense? What else can I talk about? What other questions do you have?
Yeah. And when I say mixed signals, we're talking that your words are not necessarily matching up with the emotions that you appear to be expressing. So you really do have to pay attention to what emotions you are going to express, because you are still, when you're dealing with a vaccine hesitant parent, you're still frustrated. There's still a piece of you that's angry. But if my body language is I'm frustrated and I'm angry, but I'm saying nice things, that comes across as really disingenuous.
Oh, it does. It does. I've worked with people in the past where I've had them do an exercise where they're standing and they're saying sentences in their work life or scenarios, but I just have them relax their hands by their side. It's very difficult to do. You should try that sometime. We like to use our hands to protect ourselves, and I jokingly call it Tyrannosaurus arms. We do that a lot when we're talking, when we're having difficult conversations, and when we open ourselves and put our arms to our sides. That form of body language is much more welcoming.
Yeah.
When you think about that in a social setting.
Yeah. We also want to think about what our natural communication style is, because there's some physicians who may come across as having sort of a bad bedside manner. And it may just be that their natural communication style, is different than what some families may expect it to be. Maybe they do cross their arms, not because they're angry or upset, because they just always cross their arms. Mm-hmm. Or maybe they never sit down because they just never sit down. They just like to stand in the exam room. So in that sense, there is some, even when we're not upset, we should be paying attention to sort of how our bodies are, responding in the moment in just normal, non-stressful situations, because we may give false cues based on what our normal is, and we may want to change that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You said something that I'd like to come back to. You used the term bedside manner. And I think a lot of people, they think about this emotional intelligence that we're talking about. Where's the intersect, do you think, as a physician, between bedside manner and EQ?
Well, I think bedside manner is always going to be the experience of the patient or the family because they're experiencing a bedside manner. And so what I am projecting is going to come across as either to them, something positive or perhaps something negative. And if it's something negative, I would want to know that I'm coming across that way so that I can become aware when I'm doing that and can change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think for myself, I think of those two things as separate. But they're still together. And if we take that bedside manner and that patient-centered care and that experience, and then we start bringing in the relationships with others outside of the patient, which there are many, I think that's where the sweet spot is in that intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing that can be controversial, but I think it needs to be said because physicians need to be advocates for this, is that there is an intersect between the practice of medicine and the business of medicine. And there are pressures outside of everything that we're talking about. So pressures to see more patients, to be more efficient, to be more effective, that are really in direct opposition to improving our emotional intelligence, to having genuine relationships where we can affect people's decisions and improve health outcomes. But that's more difficult to do if there's pressure to see X number of patients in a compressed time period. So how do we work with the folks who are on the business side of medicine? Because, at the same time, you got to pay the bills, right? I mean, so I'm not saying that that's less important, but how do we all work together to have a great organization?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, you can't pay the bills if no one's there left to do the work, right? And so in my world, we start thinking about employee retention and engagement, and people tend to perform and stay at an organization because they believe in its values and its mission, not just your day-to-day tactical work that you do. And a lot of that comes from the relationships that you have with the people you work with. And so driving the business side, hopefully, folks are working with organizations that do believe that people drive the business. And meeting those, I don't know, would you call it a quota? Yes, that's part of it, but remembering that those relationships with your peers, your colleagues, your frontline staff, all the way up to your relationship with the organization. We have relationships with the organization. We can choose to stand behind the mission, or we can say, well, I'm going to work today, right? And so the sweet spot there is for the business to figure out how to inspire and encourage the folks who work with the business to believe in those things.
Yeah. Really, we can use the skills that we've learned with emotional intelligence as we think about those kind of big overarching conflicts between the practice of medicine and the business of medicine, in that it's helpful to be in the moment and think about, sort of have empathy for the other side. For example, the business side of medicine, the bottom line is we got to get the bills paid. But then I need to have the empathy to think, well, why do they think that? Because they don't want the place to close down, because they want it to be successful, that they want to be here and open for people to come in and get care. And so it's they are also caring about the patient in terms of wanting to do things in a responsible manner, from a financial standpoint. And so if I don't take the time to think about it from their point of view, I'm not going to understand. And then it's going to be more difficult for us to work together.
Oh, yeah. And, in my world, I'm a function of human resources. And in many organizations, HR is where you go if you're in trouble or you have a question about your paycheck. But fostering a partnership with some of your shared business units like HR, saying, hey, we're partners and we're going to make this place great together. It's a new... new-ish way of thinking about the business holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and there is so much more about EQ. So we called this Introduction to EQ because that's really what it is. For instance, the book that I had mentioned, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, for each of these 4 key skills, they have like 17 different strategies for each one that you can strengthen it. And so I would really, for folks who are interested in this, it's a terrific resource. And I don't get any kickback. There's no, financial relationship between the authors and myself. I just think it's really helpful. And so I am going to put a link in the show notes to that book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, and where you can find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And we'll put those in the show notes for folks to find. But, we could easily talk an hour on just self-awareness, on just social awareness, on just relationship management and self-management, right? I mean, we could do an hour on each of those easily.
Very easily.
Yeah. So anyway, really great stuff. And we just appreciate you stopping by very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I love this topic. I can't stress its importance, not only to our relationships with others, but, our relationship with ourselves.
Yeah. And I think this is something in medicine that we are going to hear more about because it's really fundamental it also changes our satisfaction. When you start to really pay attention to the relationships that you have in the exam room and in the office and start to improve those relationships, really makes the quality of life better.
Absolutely.
For everybody.
Yeah.
All right. Well, once again, Erica Banta, the Director of Talent Management for The Ohio State University, thanks so much for stopping by today.
Thank you, Dr. Mike.
We are back with just enough time to say thanks once again to all of you for taking time out of your day and making PediaCast a part of it. Really do appreciate that. Also, thanks to our guest this week, Erica Banta, Certified Leadership Development and Succession Strategist and the Director of Talent Management for The Ohio State University. Don't forget, you can find PediaCast wherever podcasts are found, or in the Apple and Google podcast apps, iHeartRadio, Spotify, SoundCloud, Amazon Music, and most other podcast apps for iOS and Android. Our landing site is PediaCastCME.org. You will find our entire archive of past programs there, along with show notes for each episode, our CME information, terms of use agreement, and that handy contact page if you would like to suggest a future topic for the show. Reviews are also helpful wherever you get your podcasts. We always appreciate when you share your thoughts about the show. And we love connecting with you on social media. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Simply search for PediaCast. So you've listened to the podcast. Now be sure to claim your free Category 1 continuing medical education credit. Easy thing to do. Simply head over to the show notes for this episode, PediaCastCME.org. And you'll find a link to the post-test in the show notes. Follow that link to Cloud CME, take and pass the post-test, and the Category 1 credit is yours. Super easy, right? And again, we offer credit to many pediatric professionals, not just doctors, also nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, social workers, and dentists. Of course, you always want to make sure the content of the episode matches your scope of practice, and today's episode will match everyone's scope of practice. It's that important. Complete details are available at PediaCastCME.org. Also, don't forget, we have an evidence-based podcast for moms and dads, plain PediaCast, without the CME. Lots of pediatricians and other providers tune in as we cover pediatric news, answer listener questions, and interview pediatric and parenting experts. Shows available at the landing site for that program, PediaCast.org. Also available wherever podcasts are found. Simply search for PediaCast. Thanks again for stopping by, and until next time, this is Dr. Mike saying stay informed, keep it evidence-based, and take care of those kids. So long, everybody.
This program is a production of Nationwide Children's. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on PediaCast, CME.